Easter is the celebration of the resurrection of Jesus, but it's more than just a holiday. Without Jesus' resurrection, Christianity ceases to function properly and ultimately really doesn't make any sense. Hello, I'm Eric, and I'm here to help you to discover biblical truth and to apply it to your life. Now, in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the resurrection of Jesus so that we can understand it better and understand why it is so important. And in order to do so, we will look at several things in two main sections. The first section is going to consist of 4 parts. First, we'll look into the understanding of what the term resurrection means. Then we'll provide a short overview of the biblical accounts, the Gospels and Acts, and then 1 Corinthians 15, with some clues as to why we can trust them, with some concepts to take away before moving on to the next part of the video. Now, the second section is going to consist of 3 parts. First, we'll look at some really good facts that even secular scholars agree on that are best answered by Jesus' resurrection, though they wouldn't agree with that conclusion. Then we'll address some counterclaims that some people have proposed in order to dismiss the resurrection. And then I'll highlight some things that the resurrection means for us. Now, we're not going to go too deep into these things. My goal here is merely to provide an overview so that you can have a solid foundation on which to understand the resurrection better, and give something of a defense of it to those who question it. And there have been a few sources that have been useful to me in preparing this material that I'll provide at the end of this video that you can then use to dig deeper for yourself if you are so interested. And I'm going to provide timestamps so that you can jump around the video if you have a specific thing that you're looking for. So first of all, what is resurrection? What do we mean when we use this word? Now some people have the notion that resurrection refers to spiritual new life. This is not how the word was used or understood by the original writers or audiences. Resurrection refers to a bodily raising from the dead, understood to be so by the ancient Greeks, the Romans, and the Jews. In Greco-Roman thought, resurrection was not something that was anticipated or desired. For the most part, there was a dichotomy between body and spirit. While the soul was immortal, the body was not. The body, as with most things physical, was considered evil and something that imprisoned the soul. Now, at death, the soul was then set free, and for the soul to re-enter the body or any body would not have been considered a good thing. For the Jews, there was a wide variety of thought about the resurrection. Some, such as the Sadducees, and some of the more Hellenistic Jews, held that there was no such thing as a bodily resurrection. For others, however, resurrection was a future hope. While not a large theme in the Old Testament, the idea does show up beginning with the prophets. And during the Second Temple period, thoughts about resurrection expanded. For the most part, it was believed that such a bodily resurrection would occur in the eschaton, or the end times, with the final judgment. Those who are righteous will be resurrected to experience God's kingdom and presence. Those who are unrighteous will be resurrected to experience eternal torment outside of God's presence. So from this, we understand that when we talk about Jesus' resurrection, we are saying that Jesus bodily rose from the dead, possessing a physical body. It wasn't just some spiritual thing. It also means that when we talk about resurrection for ourselves, we're also talking about a physical bodily resurrection. Using resurrection language to refer to the new life that we have in Jesus now dismisses the ancient understanding of resurrection as well as the promise of Scripture. Resurrection for us has not happened yet. It is part of the age to come and something that we look forward to. But we do have new life now because of Jesus' resurrection. And this new life ultimately points to its ultimate fulfillment in our resurrection as well. Now, all 4 Gospels and Acts record that Jesus was raised from the dead. And these accounts of the resurrection and the resurrection appearances in the Gospels and Acts can be found in the following places: Matthew chapter 28, Mark chapter 16, Luke chapter 24, and John chapters 20 and 21, as well as in the first 11 verses of Acts. Now, no scriptural account records how it happened. And this is actually a good thing as far as that, because as we'll talk about later, some people believe that the disciples made up the story, or that it was a legend that tacked on to the early Christianity. But what this shows is that, unlike the Gospel of Thomas and some other fictional accounts that develop later, the Gospels don't do that. I think it was the Gospel of Thomas talks about, 2 angels whose heads reach the clouds, and then Jesus comes out. They carry Jesus out and on his shoulders, and his head goes above the clouds, and a cross follows him and talks and stuff like that. That's legendary stuff. That kind of thing does not appear in the Gospels. And when it comes to the Gospel accounts, there are some differences in the accounts that are given. And these variations deal with a number of angels, or men, as they're called in a couple of the Gospels, who were present, the locations of Jesus' appearances to the disciples, when and where he met them, as well as the identity of the women who went to the tomb that Sunday morning, and when exactly they went. Now, these issues, these apparent contradictions, can be easily explained. And one of the key explanations is, this is for any of the discrepancies in the Gospels, or I hate apparent discrepancies, anytime where they kind of disagree over the number of something. For the most part, the Gospel authors weren't writing to record history exactly as it happened. They're writing with a purpose. They're writing with themes. They're writing with theology in mind. And so if there was one person who did the talking, they talked about the one person rather than the two or others that were there. Or they focused on somebody that their audience might know and recognize. It doesn't change the fact that there might have been more there. They're just recording the one who's talking. And now Craig Blomberg counters these apparent contradictions in the resurrection accounts. And he writes this about these things. A, angels generally appear in Scripture as men. It's true. And if one of the two were the primary spokesman, it would not be surprising if sometimes only he were mentioned. And that was actually a common occurrence in writings of this time as well, other historical writings at this time. B, it's likely that Jesus appeared to the 11 in Jerusalem, then later in Galilee when they had gone home after the Passover, and then once again in Jerusalem upon their return in preparation for the Feast of Pentecost. So basically, the Gospel authors are recording certain appearances that fit within what they're trying to say. They're not trying to cover everything chronologically as it happened to include every single event. I mean, they're not writing modern biographies which are trying to do that. They're writing in historical biographies in a genre that, it's kind of a blend of different things. But here's the thing, they're being truthful. They're telling what happened. They're just not including every single detail of it. All right, C, or the third thing here. If Salome, talking about the women who went to the tomb, is both the mother of James and John and the sister of Mary, Jesus' mother, there is no reconcilable problem with the list of women because they list different women. Some are mentioned, some are not. I would also add, maybe they mentioned, the author of the gospel mentioned the one that was more familiar, ones that were more familiar with his audience, so that they would say, oh, that's who they're talking about. That person was there, right? All right, now also, lastly, it is not unfair to describe the world as still rather dark at the first glimpse of morning daylight, right? So just because the sun has started to come up doesn't mean it's still dark right here, right? The sun has started to come up. It's early dawn. You can still say it's dark, but the light is shining. But it's still dark. Now, he goes on to say this. The apparent discord among the Gospels can be alleviated, but it must be admitted that any reconstruction of the events is speculative. So, anytime that there's an apparent discrepancy or an apparent contradiction, Blomberg's saying that, these can be easily explained. And we've explained some of them. They all have explanations that fit within what the gospel authors were trying to do in the way that people wrote back in the day. It would be anachronistic of us, it would be unfair of us to hold ancient writers to the standards that we have for when we write history, historiography with footnotes and trying to include every little thing and all that sort of thing. That's not the way they wrote. So the thing is, though, we can't create an exact play-by-play of the events as they happened. We just can't do that because, we can harmonize them to some extent, but exactly how they fit together in the order they fit together as far as Jesus's resurrection appearances, we really can't do that. We can say that these took place in Jerusalem, these took place in Galilee, and so was it the first time in Jerusalem, the second? There are various different things. Some take place Easter Sunday, right? But others took place a little bit later. Now, that wasn't the goal of the gospel authors. They weren't trying to copy one another, right? And this difference highlights the fact that the authors utilized different source materials, right? Mark wasn't there. He used Peter and maybe some other source material. Luke wasn't there. And so he's pulling together all these different sources from all these different eyewitnesses and creating and crafting a narrative, an account of what took place. And for Luke, he was following a model. When we start out in Luke, it starts out in Jerusalem. Right? The Gospel of Luke starts out in Jerusalem at the temple. And how does Luke end? In Jerusalem at the temple. And so Luke focuses on the resurrection accounts that take place in or near Jerusalem, because Jesus' ministry starts off in Galilee of the Gentiles. It moves into Samaria and into Judea. And then you see Acts. It goes from Jerusalem and Judea through Samaria to the lands, the areas of the Gentiles. Luke is following a pattern in telling his story. And so they're all writing with different purposes to address different things. They're all writing with their own manners and styles and ways of telling stories. And we need to let the gospel authors be the gospel authors, right? So now there are, as we just said, there are some distinctions in the gospels that actually point out that there was no collusion between the gospel authors. They weren't getting together to tell the same story as far as exactly the same way. So they tell the events, and sometimes they highlight the same thing, and sometimes they emphasize something different, or they pull in a different story. Matthew mentions the Roman guard. Some mention certain names, others don't. Luke tells the story of the disciples who meet Jesus on the road to Emmaus after the resurrection. None of the other gospels do that. John mentions several things that the others don't, because they're writing with different purposes to different audiences, with different purposes to different audiences. Now, there is, however, substantial agreement between the gospel accounts as far as what they tell. And so William Lane Craig identifies this substantial agreement. He writes, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified in Jerusalem by Roman authority during the Passover feast, having been arrested and convicted on charges of blasphemy by the Jewish Sanhedrin and then slandered before the governor Pilate on charges of treason. He died within several hours and was buried Friday afternoon by Joseph of Arimathea in the tomb, which was then shut with a stone. Certain female followers of Jesus, including Mary Magdalene, having observed his interment, visited his tomb early on Sunday morning only to find it empty. Thereafter, Jesus appeared alive from the dead to the disciples, including Peter, who then became proclaimers of the message of his resurrection. So this is what all the Gospels agree on. They all agree on this. Yeah, they might have a little detail here, a little detail there that they're focusing in on, or emphasizing more than the others, or another story they're emphasizing than the others, but they all agree on this, and this is the heart of it. Jesus was crucified, he died, he was buried in a borrowed tomb, and the tomb was empty the next day, and then he appeared to a bunch of different people. Bodily, physically appeared to a bunch of different people, not just in a vision. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. Now, the accounts that we look at in the Gospels also reveal some embarrassing details. First, embarrassing detail, that it was women who discovered the tomb and told the disciples. Now, why would this be embarrassing? We wouldn't think anything of that today. But in the ancient world, a woman's testimony was pretty much worthless. Right? So, when they came and told the disciples, the female disciples came and told the rest of the disciples, the apostles, hey, the tomb is empty. They're like, it's nonsense. What nonsense are you talking about? It just wasn't believed. Now, that was the way things were back then. And so we're not going to, attempt to say, well, they should have listened. Well, maybe they should have. And they should have, because the tomb was empty. Now, if the disciples had made all of this up, they wouldn't have started off with Jesus appearing to women or women discovering the tomb, because their testimony would have been considered worthless. They were kind of second-class citizens. They were on the low social status of the totem pole. Now, another embarrassing fact of this is that the disciples were doubtful that this had happened. Previously in the Gospels, they are presented as not understanding Jesus' teaching, especially with regard to his prophesied death and resurrection. They just didn't get it. And the Gospels talk about that. The Gospels mention it. There's a lot of times where the disciples just didn't get what Jesus was saying, and he had to then further explain the parable to them or something else. But when it comes to their death and resurrection, it just went over their heads. Now, part of that is because of that cultural understanding that resurrection was something that would happen, but it would happen in the end. It would happen a long time from then. It'll happen, with the establishment of that kingdom. And it would be en masse. It would be a lot of people. It wouldn't just be like one person, right? So resurrection was something that happens to all people in the future in the judgment day. So it didn't quite click that Jesus was saying, hey, I am going to be resurrected, even though he said it. He made it fairly clear. So, I mean, some of the Pharisees, they seem to have understood what Jesus was saying, but the disciples apparently did not. Now, the disciples are also presented as cowering in fear, as being afraid, as being like, they've locked themselves away in the upper room, and there's the idea that, they might be next. So they're in hiding. They're afraid. They all scatter when Jesus is arrested. That's very embarrassing. If they were making this up, I don't think that they would make themselves out to look as bad as they often do. The Gospels don't portray the disciples in a very good light when it comes to the last day of Jesus' life. It really doesn't. And I think if they were making it up, they would make themselves look better. So we don't think they're making it up. It's not likely. Now, another issue is that the Gospel actually names names. This is something very important. These are names of people that the original audiences could verify. Such people as Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus. Now, it's unlikely that these names would just be made up, right? It would be easy for Christianity's early critics to simply say that there was no such people. There's no such person as Joseph of Arimathea who's on the Sanhedrin. Nicodemus, who is that? And if you were using their names and they weren't doing what you said in the account in what you're saying that they did, they could say, I never did that. That wasn't me. Why are you making this stuff up? So, do they do this? Are there critics that say these people didn't exist, or do they say no? Do we have records of that? No. We don't have a record of this. So the Gospels, when we look at the Gospels, we can trust what they're saying. The discrepancies, or the apparent discrepancies, the differences, that's better. The differences merely highlight the fact that they are reliable. It's eyewitness testimony and based upon eyewitness research. And the details just point out the embarrassing details, the naming of names, the historicity of it. The Gospels are reliable when it comes to telling what happened before Jesus' death, in his burial, and in his resurrection. You can trust what the Gospels say. Now, the Gospel accounts are trustworthy and reliable in telling the story, but here's the interesting thing. They're not the earliest account that we have that talk about Jesus' death and resurrection. That'll actually come from 1 Corinthians 15, verses 3 through 11. Now, Paul was writing 1 Corinthians about 20 years or so, a little earlier, about 20, 25 years, after Jesus' resurrection. So that's within a very short time frame. But in these verses from 1 Corinthians 15, Paul puts forth a teaching, and perhaps it's a creed, that scholars say goes back to within a few years of the event it talks about. So when we say within a few years, we're talking about somewhere around 35, 36 AD. Right? That's just within a few years of when Jesus died and rose from the dead. And that's how far this goes back. The scholars will agree on these things. And so let's look at this passage as far as what verses 3 through 8 say. And this is where it contains most of it. He says this, Paul writes, "For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received." So Paul says this is of first importance. This is the primary thing. And I believe this is like one of the first earliest things too. And this is what it is. He says this. What did I receive? That Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Right? And so that might be part of the early creed, but Paul goes on. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now. But some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. So Paul starts off, he says, this is important. You need to get this. The Corinthians, were dealing with some teaching that some people say either the resurrection didn't happen or the resurrection had already happened for people in general, or that there's no such thing as resurrection, right? That just doesn't happen. That Greek idea, that resurrection, that's just funny and weird, When they were proclaiming resurrection, the Greek word is anastasis, and some think that, when Paul was preaching this, they thought he was talking about a name, like a person's name or a god or goddess's name, anastasis, But Paul says, no, this is first. This is what we preached. Jesus died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures. Right? This goes back to the earliest years within Christianity. Within the first few years of the church was teaching that Jesus had died, was buried, and rose from the dead. And then he appeared to a bunch of people who were identifiable. Cephas, that's Peter. He appeared to the 12, right? That probably includes Matthias, the person they chose to replace Judas. He appeared to more than 500 people at one time and says, you know what, most of them were still alive. You can go ask them. They will tell you they met the risen Jesus who was there physically with them. Some have died, but some are still there. You could go ask him. Then he appeared to James. That's Jesus' brother who becomes a leader in the church. Then to all the apostles. This is probably like a greater group that was not just the 12, but, those kind of around them as well. And last of all, Paul says, he appeared to me, right? To me also. Now, as we mentioned earlier, some critical scholars like to think that the resurrection is simply a legend, a fantasy, if you will, that kind of grew and then kind of was tacked onto Christianity, and then it kind of snowballed and grew, kind of like a game of telephone. You ever played that game? You whisper something around the room, and the further away it gets, it changes until you got something you didn't start with. Well, that's not likely the case here, because guess what? Look, this early creed shows that the church, Christianity, from the very beginning has taught that Jesus died, was buried, and rose from the dead, right? So that argument just doesn't work. It doesn't make sense based upon the evidence and the reliability of the scriptures reliability of the scriptures. And the dating of this early creedal information. And we're going to talk about some of the attempts to explain away these things in just a moment. But 1 Corinthians 15, whole chapters on resurrection. And I've got a whole teaching series on this and on my YouTube channel. I'll try to put that link in the description below. But the resurrection is important, and the resurrection is attested to the earliest days of Christianity. So before we move on to the second portion of this video, the second main part, let's just talk about some takeaways from what we've just talked about. We talked about resurrection, we talked about the Gospels, we talked about 1 Corinthians. So just some key takeaways to kind of remind us before we move on. First, resurrection refers to a bodily, physical raising from the dead. It does not refer to something that just takes place on the spiritual plane. It's a physical resurrection of the dead. Second, the gospel accounts can be trusted. They present themselves as recording historical events. They don't present themselves as fantasy. Apparent contradictions are addressed fairly easily, and they actually highlight that the authors were not colluding or copying one another. And the third takeaway is that the belief that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead goes back to the earliest years of Christianity, rather than being some legend that was tacked on and grew as the years passed. Now, in this second part of the video, we're going to be looking at two things. First of all, we're going to be looking at some of the evidence or facts that we have for the resurrection. Now, these lines of evidence are part of what some call the minimal facts approach. And so what that means is that these are some of the minimal facts that all reputable scholars of the issue agree are facts. Now, one of these facts doesn't quite fit because only 75% of scholars agree on it. Now, while that consensus or that agreement doesn't determine whether something is true or not, it does provide a starting point in a conversation with unbelievers over whether or not Jesus was raised from the dead. Now, other evidences can be referenced, but, in this video, we're just merely doing an overview, doing kind of like an introduction to the topic to provide a foundation. We generally just don't have the time to do all of that here. Now, after providing these facts, we're going to address some counterclaims that are made to reject the resurrection of Jesus. Now, and as we'll see, those claims are flawed. They have severe problems that undermine them and make most of them improbable, if not impossible. Now, what we're going to see in this section of the video, in the second half of the video, is that there's very good evidence that Jesus was raised bodily from the dead, And the thing is, his resurrection is the best explanation for that evidence. So let's talk about evidence for the resurrection. And we're going to look at 4 lines of evidence, 4 facts. First, we're going to see that Jesus did die by crucifixion. Second, we'll explore the empty tomb. Third, we'll address that it was a life-changing belief for the early disciples. And then we'll look at the conversions of 2 men who were not friendly to Christianity, Paul and James, the brother of Jesus. So let's take a look at the first line of evidence, the first fact. Jesus' death by crucifixion. Now, I warn you, what I'm going to tell you might be a little sensitive for you if you're a little squeamish, because Roman crucifixion, yeah, it's not good. All right. Now, so Jesus did die by crucifixion. This is one of those facts that everybody agrees on. Not only do the Christian sources talk about this, but non-Christians do as well. We've been talking about primary sources from early on in Christianity's history. Early sources mention Jesus of Nazareth as being crucified, right? And that means that he did indeed die. Now, why can we say that? Because he was crucified, he died. Well, Roman crucifixion was a process that entailed several things generally. And if you've witnessed the Passion of the Christ, that movie a while back, you'll recognize how serious this is. That was fairly historically accurate. First, the one to be crucified was scourged with what is essentially a cat of 9 tails. And this is basically a handle. It's a whip. It's got several strands of leather coming off of it. And there were sharp pieces of things like broken pottery or metal or rock and bone that was bound to them. And the victim of the scourging was tied to a post. Tied to the post, arms up like this, your back exposed. You're stripped of all your clothes, so there's no protection from that. And then a Roman soldier who was expertly skilled in this would whip the person being scourged. And the sharp pieces would lodge into the victim's flesh and then rip it out when the lashes were withdrawn. And this would leave gaping wounds that would reveal bone. It would reveal organs, and it probably even caused organ damage, actual physical damage to the organs. That's how deep these lacerations would go. So after being scourged, the victim would then be forced to carry the crossbar to the site of the execution. So your arms would be tied. The person who's walking, arms would be tied, and you'd have to carry this post across your whipped back. So pain was already excruciating. And after, this is already, you've been beaten and everything else too. So you're carrying this. So if you're, with any misstep, if you fall, guess what? You're landing face first into the dirt with a heavy crossbeam on your shoulders. When you look at the gospel accounts, we learned that a man by the name of Simon, who is from Cyrene, or Cyrene as it's sometimes pronounced, would be forced to, Cyrenaica, actually, he was forced to carry Jesus' cross for him. Now, once you're to the site of the crucifixion, the crossbar would be either laid down or onto the ground, or it would be the post attached to the post. It could happen before or after, depending on your location and how they did things exactly. But if you were being crucified, they would drive nails through your wrist. Now, it says hand, but in the ancient world, this was your hand. So they included the wrist as part of the hand. And so they would drive a nail through your hand, and it would either crush or touch the nerves that run through your arm. So it caused excruciating pain. And the word excruciating means out of the cross or from the cross. That they created a word to capture how painful crucifixion was, right? So and next time you use the word excruciating or hear it, know that it's referencing pain, a word that came up from the pain of being crucified. All right, so after that, the post would be stood up, or your feet would be nailed into if the post was laying on the ground. Your feet would be nailed into, and then they would put the cross up, or they would put you on top of after your hands up, and then they would nail your feet, depending on your location. And so now that was done in such a way that your body is not straight, it's not relaxed, it's kind of hunched and tightened a little bit. And so if you just stay down, you're not going to be able to breathe. To breathe, you have to push or pull yourself up a little bit. Now, if you're pulling yourself up, remember, you got those nerves being touched. You've got nails driven through your feet. So it's going to cause pain just to be able to breathe in and out, right? So, and sometimes what this process would do is, I remember reading somewhere that it could actually pop your arms out of the shoulder socket because you're just pulling so much and it's in such an awkward position. And so you even rely more so upon your feet to push yourselves up. Now, in order to speed along the process, now sometimes the Romans would let you just hang there for days upon end. But in certain areas and certain places, they would want to hurry things up. And in Jerusalem, that was one of the places because of the prescriptions from the Jews, and you don't want to cause too much civil unrest because Rome doesn't like that. What they would do is they would actually, if they crucified somebody on that Friday, they would take them down before the Sabbath just to respect the local customs so that there wouldn't be any riots or anything like that. That didn't always work, but, that's just kind of the way things. And so that's what they did. What they would generally do if they had to take a body down sooner to speed along the process, because it could take a long time, is they would break the leg bones so that you couldn't push up anymore. You could not push yourself up with your legs. And so then you wouldn't be able to breathe, and you would suffocate, you would asphyxiate, you would die. Right? So, if the person was already dead, they would also take a spear and just make sure, stab him in the heart. And the gospel accounts refer to Jesus enduring all of these things. He was crucified by experts in crucifixion, whose job was to ensure that the person who was on that cross actually died, right? Jesus died by crucifixion, and this is something that all the scholars agree on, right? So Jesus did die. Now, another fact that 75% of critical and reputable scholars agree on is that the tomb was empty. Now, there are those who disagree, but they are in the minority based upon the statistic. Now, this fact is one that is attested by the Gospels and logic as well. So, William Lane Craig offers 5 lines of evidence for the empty tomb. First, the historical reliability of the story of Jesus' burial supports the empty tomb. He writes this. Why? First, the disciples could not have believed in Jesus' resurrection if his corpse still lay in the tomb. It would have been wholly un-Jewish, not to say stupid, to believe that a man was raised from the dead when his body was known to still be in the grave, Second, even if the disciples had preached Jesus' resurrection despite his occupied tomb, scarcely anybody else would have believed them. One of the most remarkable facts about the early Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection was that it flourished in the very city where Jesus had been publicly crucified. So long as the people of Jerusalem thought that Jesus' body was in the tomb, few would have been prepared to believe such nonsense as that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And third, even if they had so believed, the Jewish authorities would have exposed the whole affair simply by pointing to Jesus' tomb, or perhaps even exhuming the body as decisive proof that Jesus had not been raised. You get Craig's first point. Basically, it wouldn't have made sense for the disciples to be preaching Jesus raised from the dead if his body was still in the tomb, and the opponents of Christianity could have produced the body, right? The second second line of evidence in support of the empty tomb, Craig identifies as the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb is independently reported in very early sources. We've talked about that. This includes Mark's ending. Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, we talked about that. Matthew's mention of the guard, signifying a unique source. We have independent sources that point to the empty tomb. The third line of evidence is Mark's story is simple and lacks legendary development. That is, it's unembellished by theological motifs. Mark basically says, tomb was empty. He doesn't describe it. He does not use anything else. Basically, the tomb's empty. Right? So, it's unembellished. There's no theological, well, why is the tomb empty? Or how did this happen? Or anything like that. It's just empty. There's no legendary development, nothing tacked onto it, nothing added onto it. It's pretty simple. And that's a line of evidence for this. Fourth line of evidence is the tomb was probably discovered empty by women. We talked about this one a little bit already, but he goes on to say this. Well, since women were not considered credible witnesses and were low on the social ladder, Craig writes this. The fact that women, whose testimony was deemed worthless, were the chief witnesses to the fact of the empty tomb can only be plausibly explained if, like it or not, they actually were the discoverers of the empty tomb. And the Gospels faithfully record what for them was a very embarrassing fact. We talked about that a little bit earlier, just to reiterate. If you're making it up, you wouldn't have made women the first witnesses, because women were not considered good witnesses. Simple as that. Fifth line of evidence that he provides is the earliest Jewish response to the proclamation of Jesus' resurrection presupposes the empty tomb. That when they first heard about this, the religious leaders, they countered it. He writes this: the Jewish authorities did not deny the empty tomb, but instead entangled themselves in a hopeless series of absurdities trying to explain it away. In other words, the Jewish claim that the disciples had stolen the body presupposes that the body was missing. They didn't try to produce the body. They said, hey, the disciples must have stolen it. That presupposes that there is a missing body, that the tomb is empty. Now, as we've already mentioned, a majority of biblical scholars agree that the tomb was empty. Craig writes this, and he talks about this study. He says, in fact, in a survey of over 2,200 publications on the resurrection in English, in French, and in German since 1975, Gary Habermas found that 75% of scholars accepted the historicity of the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb. Did you get that? Since 1975, 75% of over 2,200 publications in 3 languages, and usually those writing in some of these languages are not predisposed to or friendly with the gospel in the first place. What he says is 75% of those scholars, they accept that the tomb was empty. It was discovered to be empty. And so that is the empty tomb. It is a fact. Now, a third piece of evidence that we have is the belief of the early disciples, right? And this is, once again, one of those things that all the scholars agree on. The disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, some who were opposed to Christianity might say, you know what? They give various different reasons why the disciples believed it, but they did believe it. Now, we have an early creed. We've already talked about that with 1 Corinthians 15 in those first few verses. That goes back to within years of the resurrection, highlighting that the church did, in fact, teach from the beginning that Jesus was bodily raised from the dead. And this was no mere legend that was tacked on or grew over time. Now, what we have shows us that the disciples truly believed in this fact. And this belief changed their lives. They went from cowering in fear of what might happen next to boldly proclaiming the risen Jesus. The disciples' lives evidenced their belief that Jesus was indeed raised from the dead. It was a key part of their proclamation. So much so that they were willing to die because of this proclamation. You know, all but one of the apostles and more than one disciple, such as Stephen, they're recorded to have died a martyr's death. That means they died for their belief. Some were beheaded, some were stoned, some were crucified, and some were even reportedly sawn in two. You know, as we'll note when confronting the claim that the disciples made this up, there simply was no reason for them to do so. And if they had made it up, more than likely, as history shows us, there would have been some recantations of this belief to save their skin. That didn't happen. None of them recanted. None of them gave up. As far, the original disciples and the original, not just the 12, but the ones who were there, they never recanted. They never gave up their belief just to save their life. Now, the disciples believed to the death that Jesus was raised from the dead. And this is just another fact that even secular scholars agree on, like we already said, but they'll find other ways. And we're going to talk about some of those ways that some try to explain or to counter that it wasn't really that Jesus was raised from the dead, but they'll say something else happened that caused the disciples to believe this. But they all agree the disciples experienced something, right? And we know that it was the actual resurrection. And because that's the best explanation that fits all of these facts that we're talking about and the next fact that we'll talk about as well. Now, the last piece of evidence, the last fact that we're going to look at is the conversions of Paul and James. Now, let's talk about Paul first. He was opposed to Christianity, right? This is how he started. He sought out the task of hunting down Christians. Now, his Jewish name was Saul, Greek name, Paul. They often went by different names in different places. And he was the epitome of what was considered to be a good Jew, right? And he writes this about himself in Philippians 3:5-6. This is what he claimed. He says, circumcised on the 8th day, of the nation of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law of Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to the righteousness which is in the law, found blameless. Now, Paul, it seems, based upon what he's saying here and how we understand things, he was quite content in his Judaism, right? He was eager to prove himself zealous for God by hunting down this heretical sect of Christians, right? But then as he was on his way to Damascus in Syria to hunt more Christians, he had an encounter with the risen Jesus. And Acts 9 records the account in its aftermath. I would encourage you to go read that there. Now, some have tried to argue that Paul had a vision induced by guilt or some other psychological condition for his persecutions, but from his own words, you kind of know that he was experiencing no grief for what he had been doing. He thought he was right and righteous in what he was doing. And just as with the other disciples, Paul's life was changed. He went from a feared persecutor to a welcome proclaimer. And his former allies turned on him. And he also would eventually die for his belief. So that's Paul. Paul's life, he converted. He had no good reason to convert outside of actually experiencing something, right? The scholars agree on that. Paul experienced something. And we know that he encountered the risen Jesus. Now, James was the brother of Jesus. During Jesus' ministry, James, along with the rest of his family, they didn't agree with what Jesus was doing, and they sought to stop him at one point. You can kind of pick that up from Mark chapter 3, verses 21 and 31. While James might have felt grief at the loss of his brother, he did not hold to Jesus' teachings. And he certainly did not expect Jesus to rise again, to rise from the dead. But we know, according to the ancient creed in 1 Corinthians 15, we've already talked about that Jesus did appear to James. And James' life was changed as well. He went from unconvinced brother to a leader in the early church. Galatians 2:9 talks about that, Acts 2:17, Acts 15:13. And it's reported that he too also died a martyr's death for what he believed, that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, with both Paul and James, there was no previous alignment with Jesus and his teachings or belief that Jesus was the Messiah. Both were unconvinced of his teaching until they encountered the resurrected Jesus and their lives were changed. And so all the scholars agree. Something happened to both of these guys and their lives were changed. And we know what that was. The answer for it all is Jesus' resurrection. Now, as we've noted in talking about these facts, just because there's agreement does not mean that they don't disagree that Jesus rose from the dead. But they will agree that these things, right? That Jesus died by crucifixion, the tomb was empty, the disciples believed Jesus rose from the dead, the early disciples, the first disciples believed Jesus rose from the dead, and something happened to Paul and James to cause them to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And so, because they disagree with the resurrection of Jesus, they will often try to offer various explanations and interpretations of these facts. Now, there are numerous claims that have been made to counter these facts, and we're going to look at some of them in just a moment. But one issue with these counterclaims is that they sometimes don't take into account all of the facts. Another one is that they rely on multiple theories in order to address these facts, and the more complicated a theory or a web of theories is, the less likely it is to be probable. That's just some logic for you there. The one explanation for all of these facts that we've talked about is that Jesus was raised physically from the dead. He left an empty tomb, and then he appeared to others in vindication that he was God, that he was raised from the dead, that he was physically now alive, though he had died. And thereafter, their lives were changed. All right, so now that we've looked at some of the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, let's look at some of these counterclaims that people make up against it. And so we're going to look at 4 claims made up of 6 theories. The first claim is that Jesus didn't die, and we're going to talk about the swoon and replacement theories with that. The second claim is that it was the wrong tomb. They misplaced the tomb, right? The third is the hallucination theory, and the fourth is the fraud claim. And this is composed of either conspiracy or deception theories. Now, so let us take a look at the first claim made. Jesus did not actually die. This is the swoon theory and the replacement theory. Now, some claim that Jesus didn't actually die. Those who make this claim propose the two theories. The first is the swoon theory. This theory holds that Jesus, while crucified, did not die. Instead, he passed out or fainted or swooned. And after he was taken down from the cross and placed in the coolness of the tomb, he woke up. Now, there are several problems with this theory that make it pretty much impossible. First, as we've talked about earlier in the video, Jesus did die on the cross. And even if he, the Romans were experts in killing people, and that's what they did. They ensured that the people who were crucified died. Now, even if he had survived that excruciating ordeal, he wouldn't have been able to exit the tomb, much less make his way to the disciples due to his injuries. Think about it. They rolled a stone in front of him, and the stone weighs probably between 1.5 to 2 tons. And there's no way you can grip the outside of the stone from the inside. It takes a bunch of men with some levers and everything else trying to move these things out of the way. Jesus couldn't have opened the tomb. Even then, as Matthew records, there was a Roman guard there. He would have had to have gotten through the Roman guard. And then even after that, he would have had to have wandered around after having lost so much blood with, a pierced side, with wounds and everything, leaving a blood trail to find the disciples, right? And even if he had done that, right? Think about this. Would they have assumed that Jesus rose from the dead if he is still covered in blood and the wounds from the crucifixion still bleeding and raw and everything else? It just doesn't, it's not, resurrection would not have been the go-to assumption, especially when we consider resurrection for the most part, there's always some outliers, for the most part was believed to be something that happens in the end, at the final judgment, to lots of people, not just to one person, right? So the swoon theory really doesn't hold any water whatsoever. Now, the second theory under this heading is proposed by Muslims and some others, and that's, it's called the replacement theory. And so the claim is that someone else was substituted in for Jesus before his crucifixion, right? And the replacement was then the one who was killed, not Jesus. Now, there are problems with this theory, too, and I'm sure you can think of a few just off the top of your head. One, it doesn't explain the empty tomb. They placed the body in the tomb, right? So, wouldn't have dealt with that. It doesn't deal with the empty tomb at all. There would have still been a body in the tomb, even if it wasn't Jesus's, it was some other body. Right, second, it doesn't account for the disciples' belief that Jesus was bodily resurrected, right? While still maintaining the wounds from the crucifixion, So it doesn't account for their belief. They wouldn't have thought Jesus was resurrected. And they wouldn't have come up with that to explain anything. And another thing is, it doesn't address what happened to Jesus. Well, what happened to Jesus? If he wasn't crucified, what happened to him, right? So this theory, too, is also one that really just doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense of any of the facts. And it just doesn't logically make sense. It leaves too many questions unanswered. So this claim, Jesus didn't die, just doesn't hold water at all. Now, a second claim made is that the tomb wasn't empty. It was just the wrong tomb they went to. Now, the disciples, they went to the wrong tomb that Sunday morning, and they found that tomb empty, but Jesus was actually still in the other tomb. Now, once again, the problems with this claim make it untenable. First, it assumes that the disciples didn't know where Jesus had been buried. And this is unlikely to be the case, as there was the tomb of a follower of Jesus, even if one in secret, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a well-respected man, and himself unlikely to be a work of fiction, as he was part of the Sanhedrin. And his tomb would have been easily enough located. The women had followed them there to see where Jesus was entombed, and they went to that tomb. If not, they could have asked. Second, when it comes to the tomb, there was the presence of the Roman guard, which would have given away the tomb's location. It's unlikely there were any other tombs in this area that were being guarded by Roman officials. And third, if this theory is correct that the disciples went to the wrong tomb and assumed his resurrection, which we've already talked about, the Roman officials as well as the Jewish religious leaders could have easily produced that still lifeless body of Jesus as proof he had not been raised from the dead. This was never done. As we've seen, the religious leaders actually bribed the guards to say that Jesus had stolen the body. And so this assumes the absence of the body in the correct tomb. So this theory doesn't make sense either. Another claim that some people make is that the disciples hallucinated a resurrected Jesus. They were so upset that they all had grief hallucinations based upon a primed expectation of Jesus' resurrection. Now, there are numerous problems with this theory, right? First, according to psychological experts, such group hallucinations with people seeing the exact same thing don't happen. This would require multiple hallucinations to both individuals and groups at different locations and at different times. And that's just not the way hallucinations work, right? Some take this by saying that some had hallucinations and then they convinced others to believe in what the few had seen. But that's just as unlikely. That doesn't make too much sense either, because even if those few had hallucinated, they would not have hallucinated the same thing. Now, the accounts embarrassingly, and I say that to emphasize this point, portray the disciples as not expecting Jesus to be raised from the dead. Scriptures show them as being despondent, unsure, afraid, lost now without their master. Their rabbi, their Messiah, the one who had placed their hope in, was gone because they still had that expectation of a military Messiah, of a Messiah who was going to come in, overthrow Roman rule, establish a new kingdom of Israel, and they would get to be there right with him. But instead, after the triumphal entry, less than a week later, Jesus is arrested, mocked, beaten, tortured, and crucified, and dead, and buried in a tomb. They'd lost all hope. Everything was lost. They had no expectation. Even though Jesus had said it, they didn't get it. They didn't understand it. And the gospel authors make this clear that they had no idea what was going on. Peter, when he saw the empty tomb, he was like, what's going on? John was the only one who might have had something of a clue. But Peter was just like, now even his body's gone. You know? That's kind of the way it presents itself there. Now, third, related to this last part, resurrection would not have been in view in their minds. Remember, there's always a few outliers, as I said earlier, but for the most part, Jews believe that the resurrection was something that would take place at the end, in the final judgment, the righteous to everlasting life, the unrighteous to everlasting separation from God, torment and stuff like that. And there's always outliers who believe slightly differently, but this was the general understanding. Now, to restate this, the Greco-Roman belief about body and spirit argued against such a thing as bodily resurrection. The Jewish belief was like I just talked about there. So we have this on no term, there's no priming for resurrection. Let's put it that way. They weren't primed to see this. They weren't primed. They did not hallucinate something that they weren't believing in to begin with as far as it happening. The fourth, this theory still doesn't account for the empty tomb. If they all hallucinated Jesus, where's the tomb at, right? Or where's the body in the tomb? They could just produce it. The religious leaders could have said, hey, no, here's Jesus' body. You didn't see Jesus. You didn't see a resurrected Jesus. And so fifth, the conversions of Paul and James don't make sense of this account either. Paul was adamantly opposed to the way of Jesus. He was persecuting the church. There was no such priming for hallucination for him. And neither did James. He was opposed to Jesus' ministry before Jesus' death. Now, related to this hallucination theory is the vision theory. And that's that the disciples had visions of a resurrected Jesus. Now, the problems are essentially the same as with hallucinations, mainly the empty tomb, understanding what resurrection actually entails, the conversion of Paul and James. But there are two ways to understand visions, subjectively and objectively. A subjective vision takes place within. It's based upon the visionary's thoughts and experiences, and so it's unique. Each vision, it would be unique. This kind of vision, if multiple people are having them, they're going to be different visions, very like hallucinations. You're going to have something different. That's if they're subjective, from within. Now, an objective vision is one that is sent from a source outside of a person. usually supernaturally. And so most who doubt the resurrection on a rejection of the supernatural would not go this route. So if they claim the disciples had a vision, ask, well, was it subjective or objective? Did it come from within? Well, that doesn't make sense because subjective visions are unique to the person. If it's objective, well, that means it comes from without that person. So what's going on with that? You have to admit that there is something supernatural going on. So the hallucination theory, along with the vision theory, doesn't account for the facts. Now, the last claim we're going to address is that it's called the fraud theory, and there's a couple variations on this. And first is that the disciples either made the whole thing up, or they were deceived into believing that Jesus rose from the dead. So the first case is that the disciples made it all up. This is the conspiracy theory. Now, whether to hold on, so why did they make it up? It could have been that they were to hold on to their faith, to keep the movement rolling, something along those lines. There are two main problems with this. First, it doesn't address the empty tomb at all. Now, some do so by adding on to the wrong tomb theory. The disciples went to the wrong tomb. We've already looked at the issues with that, and those hold the case for here. Some hold that the disciples actually did steal the body as the Jewish leaders proposed, but that's unlikely. And I like the way that Andreas Kostenberger and Darrell Bach and Josh Chatrall, I don't know which one wrote the chapter on this, but I like the way they put that in their book, Truth Matters. They write this. Stealing the body, of course, was obviously a big part of pulling this off. One wonders how a small band of otherwise honest men could hastily throw together the equivalent of a jewel heist, especially since they hadn't even considered the notion 48 hours prior, and since the scheme would require holding off a regiment of Roman soldiers who possessed far more swashbuckling skill and the heavy blades to back it up. Actually, of course, they need to avoid any detection by the security forces whatsoever, executing the crime with Navy SEAL precision. Get in, get out, without being seen. Now, does that seem very likely to you? That these fishermen and a tax collector, now maybe Simon the Zealot would be able to do something like this, but all together, and then they'd have to get past the guards. Then they'd have to move that stone, which would make a lot of noise, right? It's just not very likely, right? Now, the second main problem with the theory is that the disciples held on to the belief to the point of death. All of the disciples but one were martyred. And that is, they were killed for their belief that Jesus rose from the dead, right? None of them recanted their testimony of what they had seen and experienced. Now, history shows us that such a thing doesn't happen to those engaged in such a conspiracy. You can look up Chuck Colson and his talk. He was involved with the whole Watergate scandal. It took less than 2 weeks for one of the original conspirators to save his own skin, blurt out the whole thing, right? Now, someone caves to save themselves. None of the disciples did that. They preached a message that angered the Jewish leadership. It revolted the Gentiles that Jesus Christ crucified and resurrected. And they were willing to die for that message. This doesn't sound much like a conspiracy that holds much water. Now, a third problem is that this theory doesn't address the conversions of Paul and James. Paul was originally opposed to Christianity, and he would have suspected that the body might have been stolen and probably would have investigated that, right? He's hunting down Christians, seeing what they say. None of them recanted. It's never mentioned. It's never part of it. Paul converted, and he was looking to take out Christianity, right? James had no reason to believe such a story. He was opposed to Jesus' ministry during his life. And Scripture tells us that both Paul and James had encounters with the risen Jesus. Otherwise, they wouldn't have believed in the resurrection. There was no predisposition to do so, right? So this theory doesn't work for Paul and James. It's unlikely that this ragtag group of fishermen and people from all walks of life who did not have the religious education that Paul had, that he would have been conned into believing that Jesus was raised from the dead. That doesn't work. James was opposed to it. It doesn't make sense there. So that the conspiracy theory really doesn't hold much water either. Now, The second fraud theory is the deception theory, and it claims that the disciples were deceived by someone else into believing that Jesus was raised from the dead. Now, who that someone was, why? Why would they do so? It just gets complicated. It's a problem in and of itself. Someone, for some unknown motive, convinced the disciples that Jesus was now alive when they had no expectation for Jesus being raised from the dead. They had no belief in their hearts that that was going to happen. This theory doesn't address the empty tomb. And so you'd have to either add in the wrong tomb theory or propose that Jesus' body was stolen by somebody. But we've already addressed that as being very problematic, getting past the guards, moving the stone, all that sort of stuff. It doesn't just a cultural understanding of what resurrection entails. It's not just some spiritual thing or some mystical experience or vision or anything like that. Resurrection entails bodily raised from the dead, right? With a body, a physical body, right? And this theory also doesn't address the conversions of Paul and James for the same reasons that the conspiracy theory does. So, what does all this mean? What do we take away from what we've looked at so far in this video? Well, first, there is very good evidence that Jesus rose from the dead. And his resurrection is the only thing that makes sense of all of the evidence. Second, people make claims against Jesus' resurrection. However, those claims either do not logically make sense or they do not address all of the facts, all of the evidence. Third, we can have confidence that Jesus was physically raised from the dead. So that's the thing. We can have confidence that Jesus was physically raised from the dead, and because of that, we can be sure of several things. And Jason Carlson identifies three things. All right. So first, the resurrection of Jesus proves his deity and lordship. So Jesus' resurrection shows that he is God and Lord with authority over even death itself. It shows what Jesus said about himself in John 10, 17 through 18. For this reason the Father loves me, because I laid down my life so that I may take it up again. I have authority to lay it down, and I have authority to take it up again. The second thing that Jason identifies is that the resurrection of Jesus guarantees personal salvation. And then when I think about this, I go to Romans chapter 6, verses 4 through 7, which reads this way. Therefore, we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall be in the likeness of his resurrection. Knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we would no longer be slaves to sin, for he who has died is freed from sin. Now, Paul's talking about the new life there, but there's also that portrait of what goes on. Right? Jesus' resurrection means that we can experience new life with him. Right? New life. Free from sin. In a relationship with God the Father. The third thing that he mentions here is that the resurrection of Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus means our future resurrection and eternal life with God. Right? So 1 Corinthians, I've got several passages here that I kind of want to support what he's saying here, that the resurrection of Jesus points to and accomplishes and guarantees our future resurrection and our eternal life with God. 1 Corinthians 15, 20 through 22. But now Christ has been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who are asleep. For since by a man came death, by a man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Christ all will be made alive. And then from John 10, 28, Jesus says, and I give eternal life to them, and they will never perish, and no one will snatch them out of my hand. Right? And then John 11, 25 through 6, this is the scene at Lazarus' tomb. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies, and everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Right? So Jesus' resurrection means that we too will be resurrected to spend an eternity with God. Now, some other things about the resurrection, what it means for us is the resurrection serves as a motivator for how we are to live. As Paul closes out his discussion of resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, he says this in verse 58. Therefore, based upon what I've just said, my beloved brethren, be steadfast, immovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your toil is not in vain in the Lord. This is based upon the victory that we have in Jesus, that he has won over death, that we too will experience one day. To the Philippians, Paul writes in Philippians 3, verses 12 and 14. Not that I have already obtained it, talking about the resurrection from the dead in verse 11, or have already become perfect, but I press on so that I may lay hold of that for which also I was laid hold of by Christ Jesus. I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Paul says, this motivates my life. I am looking forward to that day when I shall be made perfect and I will experience that resurrection. And that is what I'm shooting for. That is my goal, is to get there, to win this race, to get to the finish line and receive that. And in Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 1, therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, talking about that newness of life that points to our future resurrection, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on earth, for you have died and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with him in glory. Right? And that's talking about that resurrection, that glory that comes. When Jesus comes back, that's when it's going to happen. And we need to live for that right here and right now. We need to set our mind on the things above. Right? I've got a sermon I've preached on this passage. I'll put a link in the description below. But the idea here is that the resurrection motivates our lives. And John talks about this in 1 John 2, chapters 3, verses 2 and 3. Beloved, now we are children of God. And it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him just as he is. And everyone who has this hope fixed on him purifies himself just as he, talking about Jesus, is pure. Paul says, because we're going to be like Jesus, we set our hearts on it now. We fix our hope on him now. And we live for him now. We purify ourselves. We come to God for cleansing, to live righteous lives for him. Now, one other thing that the resurrection of Jesus does, it points to the fact of our resurrection. We mentioned that. But that should give us comfort. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 through 18. For the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive and remain will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we shall always be with the Lord. Therefore, comfort one another with these words. Jesus' resurrection means our own resurrection one day. And so we are truly, for those who are believers, we don't grieve as those who are lost do. Because we know that we will be with our loved ones one day if they've trusted in Jesus too. Right? We have this going on. We have this promise that death is merely a temporary separation. The death of our loves, we're temporarily separated from them. One day we will be with them again. Now, the resurrection of Jesus is key to Christianity. If Jesus was not bodily raised from the dead, Christianity is gutted and it is utterly meaningless. But Jesus was raised bodily from the dead. And just as those who encountered the resurrected Jesus had their lives changed, so too should our lives change from our encounter with him. By faith, we trust in Jesus and the work of his death and resurrection to save us from our sins and to bring us into eternal relationship with God the Father. That is only accomplished because Jesus died and rose from the dead. Now, if you, watching this video, you've made it this far through this video, but if you've never trusted in Jesus, well, then the promises of this changed life don't apply to you. You're separated from God because of your sin. And what is your sin? Your sin is basically anything that you do that goes against God's will or his character. And we've all sinned. Every single one of us, all the human race has sinned. And that sin separates us from God. And there's nothing that we can do. There's no amount of good things that we could do to cross that separation, to outweigh the wrongs that we've done. God is holy and he won't tolerate sin forever. He's going to judge it. But right now he's merciful and gracious, and he wants a relationship with you because he does love you. He loves you so much he sent Jesus to die for you in your place. And Jesus did die. We've seen that. Jesus rose from the dead. We've seen that too. And he offers you a way of escape, a way out from under the death penalty for your sin, a way to enter into a relationship with God that's going to last forever. He did all the work. All you have to do is trust him. And what that means is that you come to him. You ask him to forgive you. You ask him to save you. You offer up your whole self to him in response to what he's done. And he's going to save you. He will do it. It's as simple as that. And then you can experience the new life he gives you in the here and now, and the resurrection to eternal life with God when Jesus comes back. So if you haven't trusted in Jesus, I would encourage you to do so. And if you have trusted in Jesus, the resurrection of Jesus is central. Are you telling other people about it? Are you telling other people how they can be saved, how they can enter into a relationship? Are you sharing the good news that death has been taken care of, our penalty for sin has been taken care of, the separation for God has been taken care of, but you got to trust in Jesus? I'd encourage you to do that too. All right. Now for some recommended resources. Now, some of these I've used to develop this video, and some aren't really addressing, are not really solely focused on the resurrection, but they're more apologetic material that do discuss the facts of the resurrection and the case for the resurrection. First of all, I'd recommend Craig Blomberg's The Historical Reliability of the Gospels. If you ever wonder, can I trust what the Gospels say? Can I trust what's going on in there? Dr. Blomberg does a very good job of talking through various different aspects that people have problems with and apparent contradictions and things like this. And he goes on to show that, yes, the Gospels are historically reliable. You can trust what they are saying. Another great book is On Guard by William Lane Craig, subtitled Defending Your Faith with Reason and Passion. This is a great resource for not just things on the resurrection, but on apologetics in general, and questions about the universe and God, and the exclusivity of the Christian faith. So this is just a great resource I would recommend as well. Now, one directly on the topic of this video is Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. In this book, they present a minimal facts approach, what they call the 4+1. I've kind of adjusted their order a little bit, and their +1 is the empty tomb, 75%, or empty tomb, 75% of scholars agree. But here they talk about the others there, and they also provide some good, helpful tips and hints, I should say, for discussing these issues, discussing the resurrection with other people. And I would say this is a very good resource if you ever want to dig a little deeper into this topic from a minimal facts standpoint. I would recommend this book as a great introduction to the topic. Now, I don't have a book in front of me for them, or for her, I should say, but more of a maximal data approach, where it looks at the historical reliability of the Gospels, as well as a few other issues, is Lydia McGrew. You can find some of her works, as well as she has a YouTube channel as well. I'll put her YouTube channel down in the description below. And there's sometimes a little discussion and tiffing, if you will, between the minimal facts and the maximal data. But use what you can when you can. And anytime you're talking to somebody else about this, you need to be talking to the person and not to the idea, in the sense that everybody's different. For some people, something might hit just right. For other people, you might take a longer route to get there. So tailor your presentation. If you're talking about this with other people, tailor that to the person. And you can figure that out as you talk. Another great resource that does talk about a little bit about the resurrection, but also a bunch of other questions about Christianity, is Greg Boyd's Letters from a Skeptic. And the subtitle tells you this topic. A son wrestles with his father's questions about Christianity. And so this is just a really great book, a really great resource as well, looking at various questions and how they can be answered. Now, the last hard copy book is this little book. I'll reference this one in this video. This is by Andreas Kostenberger, Darrell Bach, and Josh Chatraw. And that is Truth Matters, Confident Faith in a Confusing World. And it also discusses more than just the resurrection. But, it talks about unbelief, talks about God, talks about the Bible, contradictions in the Bible, the historical reliability, copies, how we got the Bible. And then one of the last things it talks about is the resurrection of Jesus. And so this is also a great resource. Now, another one I don't have a physical copy of, but I would wholeheartedly recommend as an apologetics resource is the book Core Facts by Braxton Hunter. It talks about, basically it argues for the existence of God with the core. It's an acronym. And then the facts talks about the resurrection of Jesus. And so it is also a great resource. I would definitely recommend you getting that if you're interested in this. And another resource that is associated with Braxton Hunter is Trinity Radio. They're a YouTube channel. They sometimes get behind on podcasts, but they're very frequently posting on YouTube. And it's kind of like a outreach for Trinity College of the Bible and Theological Seminary. And I don't just recommend this channel because I attend this school, and I recommend them. You can check them out at www.trinitysem.edu. It's entirely online, and it's very affordable. I don't just recommend them for that reason. I recommend them because they do a great job really with apologetics issues. And there are a few other things and topics that do come up that I'll really appreciate, as well as Dr. Braxton Hunter and Dr. Jonathan Pritchett, who's also a Trinity Sem professor and administrator. There we go. I couldn't find my word. Dr. Hunter is the president of the seminary and a professor there. Dr. Pritchett is a vice president, and he also teaches. And so it's really great. They get several playlists that you might find useful related to this topic, one of which is Evidence for Christianity, and another one is the Core Facts Study Group in particular, But I would say check out the rest of their channel too. Check out some of the other playlists. If you have questions about other religions, if you have questions about Christianity, if you have questions about pretty much anything apologetics related with atheist arguments or anything, they have debates on there. I would check out their thing. I'll link their YouTube page in the description below, as well as Braxton's website in that description. And there are numerous other resources, but these are some of the main ones that I would recommend for this study, and just for a few other issues as well. But really, just dig into it. Apologetics is a great need. People have questions all the time. And we should be able, as Christians who know our faith, and we should know why we believe, what we believe, and why we believe it, and we should be able to explain that to other people so that they could believe it too. So these are just a few resources, and if you know of any more, hey, drop them in the comments below. That would be great. I hope that this video has helped you in some way, whether it was to answer a question you may have had, or whether it helps you, gives you some confidence in what you believe. And if you have found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. I ask you to do that. If you think someone else can benefit from this, please don't hesitate to share. And if you want to stay informed as to when new videos come available, subscribe to my channel and hit that notification bell. Thank you for watching, and God bless.